All right, Concept 4 of the essay on Reconstruction. So in Concept 4, we'll be discussing the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877 and show how they brought an end to political reconstruction. In the election of 1876, a Republican defeat was all but certain. The economic depression of 1873 and the political scandals of the Grant administration were having their effects upon the American populace. The Democrats, determined to make reform the issue of the campaign, nominated Samuel J. Tilden of New York. Tilden had a reputation as a reformer because he exposed and broke up the notorious Tweed Ring and sparked many reforms as governor of New York. The Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes had been governor of Ohio 3 times and had a record, and his record was good to command the backing of party moderates. When the first election reports came in, it looked like Tilden had a sweeping victory. He had carried New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Indiana, and apparently all of the South. However, in scanning the election returns, the Republican campaign chairman, Zach Chandler, became convinced that the election might yet be won. The votes of 4 states were still in doubt: South Carolina, Florida, surprise, surprise, Louisiana, and Oregon. Without the votes of these states, Tilden had only 184 electoral votes. 185 were necessary to win in this election. On the morning after the election, Zach Chandler dispatched telegrams to each of the doubtful states, asking the Republicans in those states to hold their states. That afternoon, he announced Hayes had 185 electoral votes and the victory. In all 3 southern states, there had been intimidation and fraud on both sides. Hayes appeared to have carried South Carolina, but in Florida and Louisiana, Tilden seemed to have a safe majority. The key to the situation was that all 3 of the southern states were still under Republican control. Consequently, Republican returning boards threw out about 1,000 Democratic votes in Florida, over 13,000 in Louisiana, and gave certificates to Hayes electors. In Oregon, a Democratic governor had displaced a Republican elector on a technicality and appointed a Democrat in his position. The result of all of this was to produce a constitutional crisis with 2 sets of electoral returns from all 4 states. The Constitution provided the, quote, "The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all certificates, and the votes shall be counted." The question was, counted by whom? If the President of the Senate or the Senate did the counting, the election would go to Hayes, as the Senate had a Republican majority. If the House counted the votes, Tilden would be the president. With a deadlock for presidency, it appeared that a hot political and maybe a military battle would result. But everyone was tired of war and sectional political conflicts at this point. To settle the deadlock in Congress over electoral votes, Congress on January 29, 1877, set up an electoral commission of 15 members, 5 each from the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court, to pass on the credentials from the 4 states whose votes were in dispute. The committee had 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and the 15th member was Judge Bradley, who was theoretically nonpartisan. As it turned out, Judge Bradley, who named the next president of the United States, by a straight 8-7 vote, the commission awarded all 4 contestant states to Hayes, the Republican candidate. According to Mr. Stevens, an intimate friend of Judge Bradley first gave the state of Florida and thus the election to Tilden. However, between midnight and sunrise, Bradley changed his mind and gave the presidency to Hayes. The Democrats were understandably upset, and many talked of filibustering to halt the legal count of votes by Congress. Some Democrats saw filibustering as a way in which to gain political compromise, and this philosophy was the one which emerged as victorious. At the same time, Hayes' advisors advisors, James Garfield among them, advised him to attract Southern support by promising a new policy. Since Democratic businessmen were more anxious for peace than Tilden, Hayes became president and a political compromise was reached. The compromise of 1877 consisted of the following. First, for allowing Hayes the victory. The Southern conservatives wanted and were promised the end of military Reconstruction in the remaining 3 Southern states. The end of Reconstruction process by President Hayes in April 1877 marked not only the abandonment of political Reconstruction, but also the abandonment of Southern blacks. Next, the South wanted the return of home rule. There were 3 generally recognized parts of this unwritten agreement of self-rule, which ended social Reconstruction in the South until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. The North would hereafter keep its hands off the quote-unquote Negro problem. The rules governing race relations in the South would be written by Southern whites. Finally, these rules would concede the blacks' limited civil rights. Congress, which had enacted 3 constitutional amendments and a half a dozen enforcement acts, all designed to protect blacks, now threw in the towel and turned the quote-unquote Negro problem over to the South. That was what the South demanded as a price of reunion. And as the price would be paid by the blacks, the North did not find it exorbitant. Abandoned by the Congress and the President, blacks were now repudiated by the courts. In a long series of decisions, the courts underwrote white supremacy, states' rights, laissez-faire, and virtually nullified the 14th and the 15th Amendments insofar as they applied to rights of blacks. In the famous case Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court sanctioned segregation by declaring, quote-unquote, separate but equal facilities constitutional. Until Brown v. the Board of Education in 1854, Plessy was the constitutional foundation for the entire structure of Jim Crow laws or segregation laws in the United States from 1896 all the way up to 1954. The Plessy Court established the separate but equal doctrine. This doctrine held that blacks were not denied equal protection of the laws safeguarded by the 14th Amendment when they were provided with facilities substantially equal to those available to white persons. Obviously, the equality was theoretical rather than actual. In 1898, the court took up another step towards laissez-faire in the case of Williams versus Mississippi, or in the United States, by approving a Mississippi scheme of depriving the blacks of the ballot. The plan, which had been adopted in 1890, combined the poll tax, the literacy test, and resident requirements to reduce the number of black voters to a mere handful. Thus, the official approval of the federal courts and the cooperation of the Republican Party, the work of Reconstruction had been undone by the end of the 19th century. Third, Hayes promised to appoint a leading Southern ex-Whig to cabinet. So this is another part of the compromise of 1877. This part of the compromise was fulfilled by David Key of Tennessee, who was appointed Postmaster General. And finally, the last part of the compromise of 1877, Hayes and the Republican Party promised they would be sympathetic to Southern demands for the development of a railroad system within the South. This part of the compromise was not forthcoming, as the South did not live up to the second demand of the Republicans by making James Garfield Speaker of the House of Representatives. On these terms, the heated dispute for the presidency and control of Reconstruction process came to an end on March 2nd, 1877, 2 days before Inauguration Day. And that will conclude the lecture component of Reconstruction. Take a look at the next concept. I do have some information on lynchings that had a great deal to do with how black Southerners lost a lot of political rights within the South. So do take a look at that, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.